A data table contains all of the information from a survey. However, the information can often be better represented in a graph. A graph is a visual representation of data. Here is a bar graph of the frequencies of the superpower responses. The superpowers are categorical data, so a bar graph works nicely here. Each superpower label is placed along the horizontal axis, and the height of each bar indicates the number or frequency of each response according to the scale on the vertical axis. A frequency bar graph is useful for providing a visual comparison of the frequencies of different outcomes. We can quickly notice that flying has the most responses, while healing has the fewest responses. We can also notice that superspeed seems to have about double the number of responses as shapeshifting, and flying looks to be about double the responses of mind reading. Even though comparisons between categories are easy to make on the frequency bar graph, it is challenging to determine what fraction a category represents of all of the responses. For instance, we can't immediately determine from the graph if flying represents more than half of the responses. To better see this, we can create a graph of the relative frequencies. Here is a bar graph of the relative frequency of the superpower responses. Recall that the relative frequency is the frequency of each superpower as a percent of the total number of responses. Once again, each superpower label is placed along the horizontal axis, while the vertical axis is the relative frequency as a percent for each response. Using this relative frequency bar graph, we can still easily compare the different categories and notice that flying has the most responses, while healing has the fewest responses. And superspeed is still about double shapeshifting. However, a relative frequency graph also provides information about what fraction each category represents of the total responses. We can see that the flying category represents just a little bit less than 50%, or half of the responses, and that mind reading was about 25%, or 1/4 of the responses. This is an added benefit of creating a relative frequency bar graph instead of a frequency bar graph. Here is the frequency graph and the relative frequency graph for the superpower data. What similarities and differences do you notice between these two graphs? Even though the scales on the vertical axes of each graph are different, you may have noticed that the general shape of each graph is the same. This allows both graphs to be used for comparisons between categories. While both graphs have the same general shape, each graph provides different data. The frequency graph provides the number of responses for each category, while the relative frequency graph provides the percent that each category represents of the total responses. The graph that is chosen to best represent the data will depend on the desired information that we want to communicate. There are times when the actual number of responses will be helpful, and other times when the relative frequency will be more informative. As mathematicians, we want to choose the appropriate graph that best represents the data for the intended purpose. Take it with you. For each of the following statements, determine whether the statement is always true, sometimes true, or never true. Explain your reasoning.